When you delve into the world of animation, sometimes you find works that are pretty bizarre. Whether it's because they contain a lot of surreal imagery or follow an especially unusual plotline, the weirdness is often intentional. But sometimes, the weirdness is instead the result of poor design. This is the case with the film we're looking at today, Freddie as F.R.O.7, created by the London-based Hollywood Road Film Productions. Before we begin, I should mention that there are two versions of this film. There's the original 1992 version, which is the main focus of this video, and a recut version titled Freddy the Frog that was released on home video in 1995. I'll explain their differences as we go along. So, let's get to it! First and foremost, the writing is a disaster. The plot is chock full of elements and subplots that don't work together, making for a rather incoherent narrative. For one, Freddy isn't just an anthropomorphic secret agent frog. As we see in a flashback at the start of the film, he's an anthropomorphic secret agent frog who used to be a magical prince until his evil Aunt Messina turned him into a frog after murdering his parents. Whew. This entire setup completely clashes with the rest of the film. What starts as a coming-of-age story about a young wizard prince saving his kingdom in medieval France suddenly changes to a story about a secret agent who has to save the modern-day UK from an evil, futuristic organization. Not only does Freddy's backstory feel like part of a completely different movie, it also has little impact on the story going forward. Details like Freddy's parents being murdered by his own aunt, his kingdom being left at the mercy of Aunt Messina, and her abilities to transform other creatures and create powerful storms, are never reincorporated. Why set all that up if it's irrelevant to the story? All it does is waste time and make things convoluted. You may also be wondering how Freddy grew up in the Middle Ages, but is still around hundreds of years later. This was never explained in the 1992 version, but the 95 version tried to with some added voiceovers. Unfortunately, it just made things even more complicated.
Freddy used his magical powers to travel around the world, through time, and was so great at using his magical powers that it was only natural he would become a secret agent.
It seems that the writers were going to great lengths to explain why their main character is a humanoid frog. However, they establish early on that talking animals aren't unusual in the film's world, and that's all the setup they really needed. There are a couple more plot elements that try to add more depth to the story, but end up falling flat. One of these is a subplot involving a romance between Freddy and Daffers, which I'll talk about more a little later, and a plot point where Freddy purposely misleads his fellow spies. Basically, the enemy organization had been stealing Britain's historical monuments, and Freddy overheard that Big Ben was the next target. But he misleads the British Secret Service by saying that Windsor Castle was going to be next. Why did he do that?
As a soldier, he would wish to capture the enemy. It's not enough.
He just assumed that the Brigadier wouldn't be cool with a plan to infiltrate the enemy base.
Now we're cut off!
Exactement.
A moment of conflict like this could have worked in terms of character development, but even though his fellow spies were upset with him, they're just fine in the very next scene, as though Freddy potentially endangering the operation never happened. It has no bearing on the story at all. The 95 version cut this plot point out entirely, showing that even if Freddy never lied, the villains managed to escape the British Secret Service regardless. Before we move on to discussing the characters, there's one more point of the story that I want to bring up.
All these represent the history of your country, the culture.
This was the most interesting piece of the story. Given that the villains have strong Nazi overtones, this idea of taking over the world by destroying every other culture doesn't feel out of place. In fact, I wish it had been expanded upon more. Maybe hit on why cultural diversity is important, or have our heroes run into conflict with each other over cultural differences. Something to give this story a little more depth and intrigue. Next up is our cast of characters, starting with the titular frog himself. The biggest problem with Freddy is that he's too perfect. He's physically powerful, he has vague magical powers that are almost limitless, he wins over the ladies instantly, and remains perfectly calm under almost any circumstance. Freddy does run into obstacles, like being trapped in a cage and dunked into a pit of sea monsters, but nothing he faces actually challenges him. Even the final battle with his aunt is a cakewalk, so much so that he barely moves from one spot during the whole fight. Another major problem with him is that he doesn't develop over the course of the story. He begins as a frightened child who tragically lost both his parents, one of whom he witnessed die. Then by the time the opening flashback ends, he has the mental fortitude of Batman. It's as though all the character development leading up to Freddy being able to confront the evils of the world happened off screen. Speaking of Batman, you would think that Freddy's past would leave deep emotional scars that would still affect him as an adult. Take Simba in The Lion King for instance. When he learned that his uncle had killed his father, he was furious.
Murderer!
When Freddy finally meets his evil aunt again, fully knowing that she killed his parents and would be a powerful adversary, he expresses no sort of anger, bitterness, or even fear.
Interesting place. I wonder what the cuisine is like.
Not quite as believable or relatable, is it? Lastly, let's take a look at what should have been one of Freddy's key traits.
The only weapon I use is my thoughts. The powers of the mind will always overcome violence.
He spent many years developing his mind powers, so it would make sense that they would be his main method of overcoming enemies. Except... he always resorts to violence first. The only time he actually uses his mind powers throughout the whole story, excluding the flashback, is at the very end. He doesn't even use them during his fight with Messina. As it is, Freddy's powers are just an excuse to save his butt through Deus Ex Machina. Rather than literally giving him mind powers, why not have him use diplomacy or other non-violent methods as a first resort? Then you can have him face inner conflicts in situations that force him to use violence. Then we have Freddy's two co-spies, Scotty and Daffers. I'm talking about these two at once because they contribute little to the story. Scotty's a basic comic relief character, the member of the team who's there to act silly.
Well, I'm certainly fulfilling that part of it.
The funniest thing about Scotty is that even though guns are his specialty, when he faces enemies with guns, his weapon of choice is... a whoopee cushion? As for Daffers, she's the team's sex symbol. Her main contributions to the film are hitting on Freddy.
Oh, I'm sure you're very hot-blooded.
And being fodder for moments like these.
Used for gadgets, but I like the landing area.
Then there's the romantic subplot between her and Freddy. Well, actually, it's hardly a plot at all. The very end suggests that they fall in love, but there's no arc or progression leading up to that. She just has the hots for the talking frog the whole time.
Well, I don't have any concealed weapons.
Oh la la.
To put that into context, that was minutes after they first met. Also, as a side note, those fanservice type moments I just showed, plus Daffers kissing Freddy, were all cut from the '95 version. Neither of these characters really do anything until the climax of the film. Up until that point, most of their time was spent captured, stranded, or just idling around. Next are Aunt Messina and El Supremo, who are about as cookie-cutter as villains come. They're aggressive, calculating sadists that want to take over the world because they want to show everyone how powerful they are. El Supremo's primary traits are making dramatic speeches, laughing maniacally, and taunting the heroes. That's about it. As for Messina, she plays a confusing dual role here. She's established as the primary villain in the beginning, being a shape-shifting sorceress and all, but for most of the film she acts like El Supremo's pet. It's never explained how they met, why she remains in her snake form all the time, or why she waits until the very end to turn back into her normal form.
Why don't you reveal yourself in your true colors? My dear Aunt Messina.
They play this up like it's supposed to be a twist or some kind of big reveal, which doesn't work at all. Freddy already knows her identity, the audience already knows her identity, so there's no element of suspense or surprise. I feel this character would have worked better if she was just a talking animal like Freddy. Cut out all the magical transforming ant stuff and make her an enemy agent, perhaps a rival. In terms of humor, the film has a few funny moments, one of which is during the final confrontation with Messina.
On the floor!
3 against 1! Not fair! Not fair!
It's a simple, well-timed gag that plays on Messina starting out threatening, then just looking silly and desperate. Then there's this moment.
You'll never guess what's gone this time. What next?
The key to this joke was that the characters were playing the scene like it was serious, with a gloomy atmosphere and everything. It probably could have been a gloomy scene if the Brigadier was looking sadly on at the empty spot where Big Ben was, but they instead made it funny by having him despairingly look on at a giant, silly cutout. It catches the viewer by surprise. The one downside to it is that the timing of the reveal is a little off. Then there are the jokes that don't work, like this instance of Freddy trying to make a one-liner.
I wonder what the cuisine is like. Perhaps you may give us haggis for dinner.
What was the punchline supposed to be? Freddy doesn't know what haggis is? Plus, the timing is completely off. The joke feels like it lingers on for too long and grinds the film's pace to a halt. Much of the rest of the jokes are Freddy rattling off typical puns, and the Brigadier getting tangled in phone cords, the latter being a running joke with almost no variation. Now let's discuss the soundtrack. There are 3 main songs in the film, the first of which plays during the opening credits.
No one seems to care. I'll be the hero with the heart of gold and get you out of there.
It's a poor choice as the opening theme for this film. Listening to these corny lyrics, I feel like I'm about to watch a sappy love story. The visuals accompanying this tune don't help either. The backgrounds may look good, but for a city like Paris, the place looks deserted. Every now and again we get a closer shot of Freddy driving, but this quickly gets repetitive. There's no excitement, no gags, nothing that says secret agent out to fight the forces of evil. You would think they'd start this off with some kind of demonstration of our hero's expertise, like him stopping a crime or taking part in a car chase. Instead, we're treated to an uneventful Sunday drive, which makes for a weak hook. The 95 cut didn't handle this well either, as instead of showing Freddy driving through Paris, it shows a bunch of static, boring shots of these castle grounds. The next song is called Evil Mania. Admittedly, it's the catchiest song in terms of music, but like the opening theme, the lyrics are really generic.
I'm gonna rule your world. I'm gonna tease you and tweeze you till you drop.
The song is just Messina clarifying that she's evil and sadistic, even though the 15-minute flashback already made that abundantly clear. The visuals are a little livelier than the opening, but still repetitious and uninteresting. It contains a lot of shots of the snake Nazis either bobbing in place or marching in circles. The sequence was almost entirely changed in the 95 version, most likely because Messina's backup dancers included members of the Ku Klux Klan. Considering the 95 cut was made by an American company, I'm guessing they deemed this imagery too offensive to include, as well as inappropriate for kids. The third and final song is called Shy Girl. Did I mention that the Loch Ness Monster was also a character in this? I didn't include her in the characters portion of this review because she contributes so little to the story. She happened to save Freddy from Messina way back when, then doesn't come back into the story until Freddy needs an underwater ally to call on. Anyway, I think having the Loch Ness Monster sing about being shy is a cute idea, but this song is just a roadblock in the story. At this point in the film, the villains had already launched their secret weapon and were just about to overrun the UK. Yet our hero takes time out to tango instead of hurrying to the rescue, so there's no sense of excitement or suspense. Just confusion as to why this song was even included. For the most part, the background music for the film is okay. It keeps to the mood of a scene well, whether it's supposed to be calm and comical, or to accompany a looming threat. Although, there was one particularly noticeable moment where the music shatters the atmosphere. It comes in towards the end, just as El Supremo is about to kill Freddy. Our hero is unconscious, left wide open for attack, and... That music sounds way too uplifting for this scene. This moment is supposed to be tense, not jovial. What makes this worse is that they used this exact same song just minutes earlier for one of the fight scenes. Now let's see how the 95 version handled it.
Ready!
There we go! It starts out with a stinger for the moment Freddy realizes what's happening, then sounds triumphant when Freddy counterattacks. It actually fits the scene. On the topic of audio, the most positive marks I can give this film are for the voice acting. While it isn't enough to offset the rest of the film's issues, the voice actors put plenty of emotion and energy into their performances. My only criticism of the voice acting is Ben Kingsley's depiction of Freddy. It's not that his performance is wooden, but for some reason he gave Freddy a fake French accent, which gets to be rather obnoxious at times. Last and certainly not least, let's discuss the animation and visuals, which I'm afraid are also riddled with problems. From the very beginning, the animation quality is inconsistent. The most obvious tell is by the way the characters move, which ranges from looking natural to being really stiff and minimal, which ends up looking cheap. Other times you can tell from shots like this. This snake ship, given its design, is supposed to have more dynamic movement than your standard airship. They capture some of that when it's actually animated, but our introduction to it is a long, awkward shot that makes it look frozen. Sometimes the characters even move around too much, making the animation look erratic and sloppy. The animation also has a number of continuity errors that come off as careless mistakes, like characters falling in one direction but then teleporting to a different spot. The most egregious example of poor continuity here is when El Supremo was demonstrating his shrink ray. As you can see, the ray's operating device is right in front of El Supremo, but Freddy is somehow able to see it by turning around, even though El Supremo is directly in front of him. How did this even happen? An error like this should have been noticed during storyboarding, let alone during editing. Many of the settings for the film also suffer from inconsistent quality. For instance, El Supremo's lair, while huge, is heavily lacking in details. It seems that it's made up of only a couple large rooms that have almost nothing in them, which isn't interesting to look at. Meanwhile, the inside of Big Ben is populated with well-detailed clockwork. Among all this, there are a few effects that look really cool. One is this shot of the snake ship opening its mouth to steal Big Ben. Look at that detailing, it's beautiful!
Then there's this shot of El Supremo's sleep ray spreading across the UK. I love the way it slithers across the country like the snakes that fired it. Plus the way it spreads out makes the country look like it's infected or breaking apart. Other than these cool special effects and moments of smoothness, the film doesn't offer much to look at. I can see why my animated movie guide described this film as an example of how not to make an animated film. I wouldn't call it a 0-star production, but I'd give it a 1.5 stars at most. Almost every aspect of the film is plagued with issues, be it the ridiculously convoluted story or the half-baked animation. The few interesting bits of the story barely come into play and just end up lost in the mix. Is one version of the film better than the other? I call it a zero-sum game. The 95 version comes across as more haphazard because of all the edits, but both versions still share the same key problems. It seems that the filmmakers were expecting, or at least hoping for, the film to succeed. While it was still in theaters, Hollywood Road Film Productions jumped the gun and began production on a sequel called Freddy Goes to Washington. But because of this film's dismal box office results, Hollywood Road ultimately went bankrupt and had to cut Freddy's trip to America short. Only 12 minutes of the sequel were completed and were never publicly released. All we have are some line tests from the film that you can find here on YouTube. I wouldn't recommend this to anyone as something to watch for fun, because aside from its most absurd plot points, Freddy as F.R.O.7 is just plain forgettable. And that concludes this episode of Animate-Ball. Thanks for watching!
If you'd like to stay up to date with all things Animate-Ball, click that little red button beneath the video that says subscribe. Feel free to discuss the animation in the comments, but please try to keep it civil. It makes the experience better for everyone. If you know of any interesting or more obscure animated works that you think would be worth discussing, don't hesitate to suggest any. Next time on Animate-Ball.
This year, Christmas will be